Today's topic is the Swatantra Party, which no longer exists in India, but once had a pretty strong role. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you once again. Today, we have with us Professor Aditya Balasubramanian. He teaches in Australia, and he's a scholar. So over to him.
Hi, well, thank you, first of all, for having me. It's great to be on the show. I've enjoyed watching a few of these over the last couple of weeks, and I'm delighted to start and to talk about the book that I've just written, which is out from Princeton University Press in the US and in India, and will be out internationally from September. It's called Toward a Free Economy, Swatantra and Opposition Politics in Democratic India. But before that, I want to talk about one of the main figures in the book who has quite an illustrious career. His name is probably the major nationalist leader from South India, C. Rajagopalachari, or affectionately known as Rajaji, who's lived from 1878 to 1972, 1878 to 1971. Rajagopalachari was a kind of small-town lawyer. And then he was converted to Gandhian politics. He rises to become Mahatma Gandhi's right-hand man, or in one description, he's known as, Gandhi describes him as his conscience keeper, before sort of falling out over a couple of issues. And he becomes the Governor General of India in 1947, when Mountbatten kind of stands down during the transfer of power. He's also the governor of West Bengal during partition. After Sardar Patel dies, he becomes for a brief period the Home Minister of India. And then he goes into retirement, but is called out to lead a brief Madras government that didn't form a majority. So he oversees a coalition between 1952 and 1954.
So he was the chief minister. He was the chief minister of what used to be the Madras state, almost all of South India at that time, right?
That's right, exactly. Right. So, and then after he goes into retirement, where he kind of works on his famous, his work written in Tamil, his Mahabharata and Ramayana, but he works on them again in English. And then by the late 1950s, he becomes disgruntled with Indian economic policy making in the direction that the mighty Indian National Congress is taking, and starts to formulate a critique of political economy in India, which becomes the platform for the Swatantra Party that he helps to found in 1959 and rises and falls between 1959 and 1971, reaching its apex in 1967 when it forms the key opposition, the formal opposition in 3 states, and it has the second largest number of seats in the Lok Sabha, gaining about 44 seats. The book that I've written is about the Swatantra Party, but it's also more than that. It's trying to intervene in the broader question, which is, how do we understand the various dimensions of India's escape from the colonial growth trap and the mass enfranchisement of a largely poor and unlettered people? What did that mean to a certain group of political actors who did not necessarily share the progressive ideals about Indian democracy and its prospects, and had an alternative vision of how Indian economic policy should be conducted? The book is focused on the periods of the 1950s and 1960s, which is broadly associated with the rule of Jawaharlal Nehru, although he is no longer living by the last part of that, from 64 to 70. He dies in 64. This is a period which, as you know, we know from the Vidped that was done with TCA Srinivasa Raghavan and Professor Mathur, associated with the commanding heights of the economy, and the 1955 Avadi resolution of the Congress Working Committee to introduce what was known as a socialistic pattern of society. At the helm of Indian politics is the Indian National Congress, which was the umbrella organization responsible for the anti-colonial nationalist movement. And at its center, at its apex, is Jawaharlal Nehru, whom after the death of Patel becomes the dominant figure, the only dominant figure.
Let me just stop you there, because you've used a term which many people may not be familiar with. You called it an umbrella organization, and I agree with you.
That's right.
But I think what you mean is that it had many, many different sets of views and people in it. It was like a big umbrella under which you could, what sometimes they call as a tent. And in the tent were many, many different people. Just they were united by a couple of causes. But in a sense, it was a coalition government run by one person, because the ideologies and views in the Congress were not at all uniform, right? So that's what an umbrella organization is. So when you said it casually, it's only for the knowledgeable. If others may not understand, oh, it was a political party, yes, but it was a political party which was an umbrella organization. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right, and thank you for pointing that out and so eloquently. So broadly, what Professor Mathur has just said is that there are various kinds of views, right? And what that means is that there are people who are going to diverge from this consensus. So a good chunk of the right wing, right, the more conservative wing of the Congress party actually splits away and becomes the Swatantra Party. Conventionally, this is thought of as zamindars and maharajas who are nostalgic for the colonial era, breaking away and forming an opposition. Now, that's not entirely wrong. In fact, right before the session, Professor Mathur and I were talking about Maharani Gayatri Devi, who wins the most one-sided election in democratic history, and essentially converts her feudal power base into a democratic victory. But at the same time, this is also about communities from South and West India that during the colonial era had been governed by a slightly more egalitarian form of land tenure, of peasant, landowning proprietorship, rather than, feudal absentee landlords over big estates, who were undergoing certain kinds of organic change and transitioning into new forms of economic activity. They were liquidating agricultural surpluses, they were investing in new forms of business, and at that point, they are encountering the long arm of the state and the new directions in which the state is starting to regulate economic activity as part of this vision of taking over the commanding heights of the economy. And so what the people who come behind Swatantra are invested in, rather than socialist planned economy, is what they call alternatively free economy. But of course, free economy means, and I try to show in the book, different things to different people. If you're somebody who is a peasant leader in what is now Andhra Pradesh, broadly it may be about more remunerative prices for agriculture and not intervening in the government, not intervening in food markets in terms of keeping prices low. It's setting a minimum price rather than a maximum price. Free economy could be about decentralization of economic policy to allow, in the case of the state of Gujarat, a cooperative to flourish and succeed that is based on private ownership rather than the dominant form of public ownership.
Right.
Free economy could mean free trade with the rest of the world. And sometimes there are certain tensions between the protagonists of free economy. However, there are four kind of common minimum points that animate free economy and differentiate it. The first is a certain aversion at the time during the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s to any kind of ideas about communism, and a particularly strident form of that, whereby everything that is even seen as mildly socialist is categorized as communism. And that is a rhetorical tactic to kind of build support. And the reason why it may strike us as bizarre today, but at the time, you have a very important influence of the international left. You have a major presence of the Soviet Union, which is trying to influence development policy in India. And you have I suppose, a battle for the soul of the world between the United States and the USSR. The second point is the defense of private property. Again, we in the Vidped with TCA Srinivasa Raghavan, there is a discussion of land reform and 1950s and the amendment of the right to property. So these are actors who I look at, who are property holders, who do not want land ceilings. They do not want the nationalization of land for public purpose. They want to continue to control their land and direct economic and use that as a resource for economic development themselves. The third aspect of this, of free economy, is decentralization, right? When the dominant economic imaginary of planning and one that there are ample visuals, if you go online and look at YouTube and see the films division of India, videos about a big country building large power plants and hydroelectric dams and this sort of thing, and economic policy that is directed from the planning commission in Lutyens, Delhi, and setting the agenda for the rest of the country. Now, what these actors whom I look at from the South and West are interested in is regional or localized forms of or units of economic activity. Right. So that's the final the third point, and then the fourth point is about in economic activity, in market transactions. There is minimal regulation by the state, whether that's in the form of taxation, whether that is in the form of industrial licensing, and I'll just go into that, or permits. And so what that means is, in order to build a business, in order to regulate how that was taking place, the state essentially required companies to apply for permits and to register their activities, which could lead to complications with the next ever-expanding set of bureaucrats who were brought in to manage the economy. It also meant, because India had scarce foreign exchange, that the government very tightly regulated the ability of firms to import machinery and to transact in foreign exchange. And so this is something that is seen to constrain them, right? So these are broadly the aspects of free economy that unite these various actors. And perhaps the major idea which has continued in the Indian lexicon to this day and is familiar to every economist who works on South Asia is the term permit license quota Raj, which is coined by C. Rajagopalachari.
Yes.
And it is currently used to describe everything that you don't like about the Indian economy. Bureaucracy, over-regulation, corruption, all of these sorts of things. But at the time of its original coinage, yes, it referred to a certain kind of frustration that small business people had dealing with getting permits and for foreign exchange and licenses for economic activity under the industrial policy resolution and the various acts that it brought about. But it was also in response to a certain kind of concentration of economic activity and its redirection. And it is essentially a critique of the three sort of dominant groups whom Rajagopalachari was identifying. One, Congress Party's big politicians. Two, it's identifying these elite bureaucrats who distribute the permits and licenses and enforce the quotas, right? And three, it is the big businesses that get the permits. And so by the 1960s, when there's a Government of India Commission report chaired by Mahalanobis, who's also one of the architects of planning, they find that, and other reports by R.K. Hazari come out by the late 1960s, they find that corporate control is essentially concentrated and that permits disproportionately go to the 20 top major business houses, right? Which is, it's not a great look for an economy that is seeking to be socialist, bring about more prosperity, etc.
Right.
Inequality is increased. So even though the impulse behind permit license Raj is a conservative kind of impulse, it does identify something that is profound that is going on. The bureaucracy definitely increases in power at this time. They become what the economist Pranab Bardhan called one of India's dominant classes. And this nexus, right, between the bureaucrat, the Congress Party politician, and big business, who also, by the way, funds the Congress Party, right? Birla's being the biggest one at the time. This is seen as a kind of oligarchic coalition of interests, right? that is hollowing out the positive content of what a democracy should be, right? And so the Swatantra alternative, right, which is something that achieves limited purchase, but some purchase, is to try to put forth with these reconciling these various ideas of free economy, a message for what they call a middle class citizen, right? Middle class citizen, but it is one that is consistently hard to pin down and identify. And this is where India's particularities are important. What does it mean? We know if we think about a Western middle class and we think about their level of education and professionalism, etc., this is something that is actually a highly elite group in India.
Yes.
And so one of the problems the Swatantra Party faces is that they find it difficult to seize the mass imaginary.
Yes.
Right.
Yes,
so
definitely.
So this is one of the concerns. And so often what they end up having to do is to rely on some of these more feudal kinds of relationships to translate their power into seats in parliament.
Okay, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you, by any chance, you may decide not to answer it, okay? But do you think that the real rival of Swatantra for the group that you just mentioned was not the Congress, but the Janasangh?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, right? I think that, so the Janasangh, for context, for people who aren't familiar with it, is the predecessor of today's BJP.
Right.
If you want to know more, there's an excellent biography that's just come out about Atal Bihari Vajpayee, which details his role in the creation of, who became Prime Minister of India, details his role in building and making that party substantial. So I would say a couple of things. I think at this point, the Janasangh is still it's building in power, but it's still rather regionally focused in North India, in the Hindi belt.
Yes.
Right. Whereas Swatantra is actually able to get what's remarkable, right? Some people ask, why did Swatantra fail? The question is, it's remarkable that Swatantra ever happened. That's the way that I answer that question. What is interesting here is, if you think about the fact that Janasangh has got operating with a base of traders,
yes,
in urban India. I would say that this is a possible constituency which Swatantra could have reached but never reached.
Never reached.
Because they were focused on, they were kind of locked in by their English language, English language limitations, which translated in some cases where they have regional power to, leaders who have got both a familiarity with the vernacular and the English language more elite spaces. But in the Hindi belt, this is not something that they're able to capture.
Right.
And the economic interests of the Janasangh at that time are secondary, but they're very narrowly defined to the interests of traders. And so they're able to keep that base very secure. So in a manner of speaking, it's easier for Swatantra to capture some of the Congress's base.
Yes.
But the committed core of Janasanghi folk, it's difficult. It would have been difficult for them from the get-go. Having said that, they do form coalitions in Bihar and certain kinds of alliances of known competition in some states. But you're right, the Janasangh is, in terms of the second choice, comes right after Swatantra, and they expand pretty substantially from their origins in the early 50s to 1967 and later on.
And since you're talking about the economic agenda that they could offer, in middle class, no, but did they really have an agenda? I noticed that you don't mention that they had one, but I'm just asking, for the rural poor.
Yeah, sure. So I think the idea is a very paternalist one, right? The idea is that if you build economic prosperity, then this will help everyone. Of course, the mode of accumulation that they are putting forth is basically the people who have money will invest it in new enterprise, etc., and it will kind of trickle down. Now, that is something that currently the orthodoxy is very much against, but there was a period in a good chunk of the world in which this was seen to be promising. Having said that, this is never directly tackled. And often when they're criticized as a rich man's party or an elite interest party, the only thing they will say, rather than offer a positive agenda for that, is to say, no, but Congress also has these people.
Yeah.
Right? Congress has gained power. So you're right, there is no proper agenda for the rural poor, and that's one of the major problems. But if you think about who's getting behind the Swatantra Party, it starts to make more sense because their interests are in a sense antithetical.
Yeah, okay. That, it's really not just, it's that the economic agenda was not comprehensive in that sense. It wasn't comprehensive at all.
Right.
Free market, what will it do for the rural poor and the landless or the small farmer? That I don't remember that being part of the plan, that what is the plan for these people?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I didn't find it in your book either.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to argue, which is that part of this economic conservatism is about draping the agrarian interests as some kind of homogeneous peasant proprietor society, and collapsing the usage of the term peasant, as I discussed, is something that is used, to symbolize everything from your rural landdress labor to your very large Rayatwari landowner.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a sort of rhetorical ploy that is used to contest, to basically contest in elections, to try to suggest a particular kind of unity, and saying that you don't want to disrupt the rural order. You want to preserve it as it is.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Because that allows you to have rural poor who do what? Who supply you cheap labor for your capital, for your move to agro industry.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's continue. Sorry to interrupt, but
so no, not at all. I think those are really important things. And I know you consider yourself a participant observer, but I always enjoy the questions. So so what happens when Swatantra gets into office, right? Well, they never get the kinds of seats in parliament such that they are able to obstruct massive programs that the government has. Having said that, the 1967 elections are the worst for the Congress's history. They lose in half of the states, and their Lok Sabha majority is reduced by over 60-70 seats. Yes. So this is substantial.
Yeah.
I would say there are three major things that Swatantra does in electoral politics and parliament that are to try to bring more checks and balances on the system. And this is where I see the contribution of Swatantra in terms of India's democratic history. It's not the only party that does some of these things, but taken together, there is a particular vision of the role of an opposition in balancing out the dominant tendencies of power that they bring. The first is in the courts, right? Swatantra has lawyers and people in the party who bring challenges with respect to the right to property.
Right.
Two major Supreme Court cases that are brought by Swatantra people are the case against the abolition of the privy purses of the princes, and which they lose, or there's kind of win, but then Indira Gandhi is able to make it happen anyway. And then, but more importantly, the bank nationalization case, R.C. Cooper versus Union of India, 1969. R.C. Cooper is a Swatantra Party man. And these cases are both argued by Nani Palkiwala, who is a major as a member of the Forum of Free Enterprise, which is one of the organizations that helps contribute to the idea of free economy. And so this is the idea of using taking the opposition, using India's tripartite system of government to try to amplify by building relying on credentials that some of these people had as members of the Constituent Assembly, and trying to represent the right to property in the courts.
So what happened in the R.C. Cooper case?
So the government does give compensation to the shareholders.
Okay.
And so the second point is about the opposition coalitions, right? So Swatantra forms coalitions in states. So for example, in Orissa, it actually leads briefly a coalition government.
Yes.
In Tamil Nadu, most importantly, it is a small presence, but it's a presence nonetheless. And it forms a multi-party coalition, which, of course, the Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam or DMK gets the most number of seats.
Yeah.
But one of the architects of that coalition is Rajgopalachari, which is generally accepted across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
And that is an important thing, not just for the limited number of seats that Swatantra gets, but also for the respectability of the DMK at that point in time.
Right.
And that defeats the Congress. And it involves forming coalitions with people whom Swatantra has a number of ideological qualms about for the business of realpolitik. We have to get them out of power. So that's the second thing that Swatantra is heavily involved in. And the third is with respect to parliamentary procedure.
Yeah.
So both in the states, and we have the opposition leader Baikaka Patel in Gujarat, and at the center with Minu Masani, who is the general secretary and head of the parliamentary opposition, we have no confidence motions that are passed. In the Lok Sabha, this is the first time they get the numbers for a proper no confidence motion in the government. We have, for the first time, opposition parties in a number of states who are part of assembly committees and parliamentary committees to look at excesses in spending, to make sure the ruling party is doing things right, to look at rectitude of parliamentary behavior. So these are ways in which they enliven or strengthen democracy, but of course this is not necessarily for progressive ends. So that's what I'm trying to show. And so the final thing that I will say is, why is this of interest to us today?
Yeah.
Right? I think there are a few things. I think the first is, if you look at the communities that got behind the Swatantra Party, not for the purpose of vote banks, but in terms of the people who are leading from the front, the communities from which they hailed, you see Tamil Brahmins, you see Patidars, Patels, you see Kammas and Reddys, you see Gaundars in Tamil Nadu. These are the caste communities. These are all what the journalist Harish Damodaran has described as India's new capitalists.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they were involved in transitions to industry, but really kind of took off after the 1990s liberalization of India. And I would extend that and say that these communities, some of them stayed in India, and some of them actually left the diaspora. And you see disproportionate representation of Patidars, Tamil Brahmins, Kammas and Reddys in the diaspora, right, where they have become extremely prosperous.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So that's one thing, including where Subodh uncle and I both live in Bethesda, Maryland. We see kind of disproportionate representation.
Yes.
The second is about today's politics.
Yeah.
And this there is a constituency of liberal intellectuals who are interested in Swatantra as an opposition to the BJP.
Yeah.
The idea being that this is a secular party, doesn't have a sectarian ideology, and insofar as there are conservative tendencies in Indian politics, this is a non-sectarian alternative that would not put the rights of minorities in peril.
Okay.
So that's another dimension of this.
Yeah.
And the idea that, and I suppose some point is that this opposition unity front that we are seeing build in advance the 2024 elections, there is a parallel here to a number of parties getting together against the Congress in the 1960s, when that was the major dominant party. And if you look at the BJP's numbers, they are the major dominant party today with certain differences.
Yeah.
And of course, the third question is about taking the point of, a number of economists and folks will talk about 1991 or a little earlier than that, the 1980s, as a point of disruption or a point of break. And I'm not trying to contest and say that that is not correct. But all that I'm saying is that in order to understand the full implications of what has taken place after 1991, we have to understand the ideological heterogeneity of the earlier period and the sort of social basis for what we see today in longer historical context. And so that's basically the third contribution that I think the book makes to our present discourse.
Well, for me, it is worth reading anyhow, because, nobody really remembers very well what the Swatantra Party did, what Rajaji did, what Minu Masani did. And they were really great people. And, they were as patriotic as anybody else, and they had very good ideas. And, some of the points that you have made, they were certainly there. So I think it is worth bringing that forward to the public eye and to the general public, that look, when you say that it was Congress rule, there was also the Communist Party, but they were the two extremes. There was the Communist Party in opposition on one side, and there was the Swatantra Party in opposition on the other side. People still may remember the Communist Party because they did win in Kerala in 1957. And then they won in West Bengal, and Jyoti Basu had a very long run. But they don't remember the other side of the coin, which is the Swatantra Party. Okay, so I think it's good in any case to have both sides and to really see why it failed. Okay, I mean, partly it was the personalities, and as they became old, they didn't have younger people to support them, I guess. But I'm going far beyond my remit. My remit is to listen and not to talk. So what else do you want to tell us?
Well, no, I mean, I would want to sort of invite people to engage with the book and consider it. But also, if there are any sort of questions that people have about it, you can always write to me. I'm at aditya.balasubramanian@anu.edu.au, and I'd just like to invite the many viewers that Professor Mathur has to be in conversation, because I mean, I know that as he said, he likes to be a participant observer, but the way that I always feel that I learn the most is by debate and discussion. So
yeah, no, it's good. We are really grateful that I'm real. You described the Congress well in the book. I think I read, but that's not novel. I mean, that description of the Congress is well known, but the description of the Swatantra is certainly fragmentally known, not so coherently and comprehensively known. And it's worth knowing because it's a key part of the Indian history, economic history, and certainly political history. And Raja Gopalachari, perhaps as the most dominant person from South India. Without Rajaji, Gandhi wouldn't have had the kind of sway that he had in South India. I mean, he had his own sway, but Rajaji was the key person. So, and those economic ideas, though they are kind of lost today. I mean, you say there are some intellectuals who are interested. I haven't met any of them, but there must be some who are interested. And then when you see the focus on subsidy Raj, what I've started to call as subsidy Raj, not the permit license quota Raj, we now have a subsidy Raj. And subsidy Raj is certainly so far from the Swatantra manifesto. They thought trickle down, right? But not subsidy Raj. And what we are seeing now is subsidy Raj. I use this term, it's not widely used, but I call it subsidy Raj. That look, you want to win the election, subsidies won't win it, but you will lose if you don't have them. So it's a requirement, necessary but not sufficient condition. It's not a sufficient, it's not even probabilistically sufficient, okay? So all this was not there in the Swatantra Party, but still it's worth remembering what they were. And I hope that you will do some more study of some other thing which really brings forward, including even the genesis of the Mahalanobi style planning, the commanding structure, control of the commanding structure, whether there were any debates and whether anybody really thought it through. That this will lead to concentration of power, or whether those reports that you mentioned, it came as a surprise. But today, it won't come as a surprise to any economist that if you set up a structured system, somebody will get control of the structured system, right? So we know that today, but we didn't know it at that time, I guess. Okay, anything else you want to add? Something interesting that you have
No,
found?
just to say thank you. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Wonderful to have you, Aditya. It's so good to see
thank
you doing
Great to
all
see
these
you.
things, and hope to come back to you in a year or so if you have something else new to say and something new interesting finding.
Absolutely. I've started to work on roads and road transport in India. So hopefully I'll have something for you next time.
Well, if you can figure out for me any way to reduce, the road fatalities, that would be nice.
All right.
You know,
I'll take that. That's an ambitious brief, but I'll run with it. Okay.
because we have the roads are sheer murder, okay, and they're not just the killing traps, and there's no first aid support of any type, which we saw in that famous Mercedes crash, in Pune in Maharashtra, in which four, Cyrus Mistry died in that crash because he didn't have his seatbelt on and there was no first aid, nothing available, and no support. So, this is really, at least to me, something that's very tough, but I think it's a great subject because right now we are seeing roads being built at a rate which we have never seen in the past. This is a very creditable achievement. We have many, many highways and they're pretty good. I guess we have electronic tolls on them also. But my serious economic question to you is that in the subsidy Raj that we now see, and we see it in the union government and in the state governments, but state governments, is there enough money? Because the private public partnership models have basically produced not much. In the end, it's government budget support. So Mr. Gadkari keeps saying, I have enough money. And when a politician says, I have enough money, it means, hey, I need some. So, because why are you addressing this issue if it's not an issue you're addressing? So is there enough money to actually build according to the capacity that India now has in terms of the construction and so on? Can they actually, what is the actual cost and how is it going to be funded in the presence of subsidy Raj? And that subsidy Raj is as I said, my term, but it's in every union government and in the state governments. And because the economic model doesn't produce enough benefits for the average low and lower income person. So you need subsidies to keep them happy. So I hope you will get a chance to look at these things and keep in touch with me. I'm very interested in this topic. And actually just today I thought that I will broaden the scope of my channel to include people who work on public health and transportation.
Oh, fantastic. I'm glad to have
and they won't be
some kind of segue. Yeah.
And they won't be just economists, because people who work on transportation and public health are not just economists.
Right.
And so that is my new thought for this chat. And if there are enough such people, we will have a separate sub-segment for transport people and a separate segment for public health people. I mean, it'll be all, as I said, it will be under an umbrella. But in that umbrella, there will be these things, and let's see where it goes. So if you find that you get to know people who are not economists, but who are experts on transportation, and not just in India, but as I'm broadening it to South Asia, then please, let's be in touch, okay? All right, let's say bye to the viewers at this point, and next time I'll be back with another person who's as erudite as Aditya. And let me add a word that most people won't know because they won't read the book. That when I read the book, I was really, really impressed. There's not a single wasted word. The expression is so articulate and so clear and so tight that there's not a single wasted word, not a single misplaced word. Everything carries its own weight. It was remarkable. I haven't seen such writing in a long time. Right? So thank you, Aditya. You really impressed me. I told your parents about it, but I'm telling you now that, my God, this guy, he knows how to write. And I would
Thank
say
you.
that's very rare. Most people don't know how to write, and most people, even who write, they waste words. But I found that there was not a single wasted word. So it's great. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye to
Thank you
the
so much.
viewers. I'll
Okay.
be back with somebody else. Till then, bye.